All right, welcome back. We're going to do a verse-by-verse study this week after we've exercised our muscles with our general how to study the Bible skills and specifically that second step of interpretation that we went over before and how to use secondary resources, how to look at Bible translations, and how to compare them. This week we're going to go verse by verse through Matthew chapter 7 and the first 5 verses. The reason those verses were chosen is because oftentimes when you're talking to someone about Christianity or Christian ethics, they're going to know 2 words out of the New Testament that they think sums up everything that Jesus taught about ethics, and those are judge not, or in our case today it'll be do not judge. And one of the main points I want you to take away from this lesson is that just keep reading. If you ever come across something in the New Testament that you think is silly, just keep reading. Because if no one were ever allowed to judge, you couldn't tell someone they did a good job. You also couldn't call pedophiles bad. You couldn't do all sorts of things. So one of the questions we're going to ask from this text is Jesus' point to never judge anyone for anything? And I think we're going to clearly see that that is not his point in this text. So in your observation step, before you dive into something like this where you select a paragraph and try to get to the meaning intent of the author, you should have already read through large portions of Scripture. So if it may be the entire Gospel of Matthew, or at least the Sermon on the Mount that starts a couple chapters earlier, and you should have gone through that several times so that you have a good idea of where the author or the speaker is going, and you could have built an outline based on your observations so far. We're going to skip ahead because we only have so much time, and what we're going to do is zoom in on these 5 verses. So first we're going to read from a word-for-word translation, and that's the NASB, a translation that we've mentioned a couple times in the last few weeks as a good word-for-word translation for doing Bible study with. And it starts, "Do not judge, so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and look, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Now I left the translation notes here where you see the different colored letters, and that first one is a note. There's a note there for that word judge, and the NASB also comments 2 other possible definitions. One is to make a habit of judging, and another is to have a judgmental attitude. And we're going to find out that that's pretty important as we move forward. Next, we're going to take a look at a more thought-for-thought translation. Like I said before, it's useful to bounce your word-for-word or whatever your chosen study text is off of another word-for-word and a thought-for-thought, depending on how much time you have, how many resources you have, which we all have, an almost unlimited number of Bible translations at our disposal now, in the 21st century English-speaking world. Anyway, this is the NIV. It's largely the same. There's not any significant difference here. But next week, or in the next lesson, we will go over a translation difference that is actually very, very significant. But I thought I'd just include this. These were the initial observations that I made. Now, your observations aren't limited to what I made, and mine aren't, perfect or exhaustive. These are observations that stood out to me initially. The first is that Jesus is speaking to the crowds. And I actually learned that from, like I said before, Matthew chapter 5, when the discourse starts. He instructs them not to judge, have a judgmental attitude, or make a habit of judging, depending on which word is, or which way is the correct way to translate. The reason to not judge, make a habit, or have a judgmental attitude is because you will be judged. The way you judge will be the same way you are judged. It's important to note here that it's not specifically said who is going to judge you. You will be measured by your standard. So already we kind of see clues that this is more a charge against hypocrites that aren't living up to their own standards. The next one I noted was Jesus asked a question that I'm calling rhetorical, comparing a speck in his audience's brother's eye with a log in his audience's eye. And then he says, the you looks at the speck in his brother's eye, but the you doesn't even notice that they have a log in their own eye. And then he asks a follow-up question that I'm saying is probably rhetorical about how his audience could say to their brother, "Let me help you with your speck," while they still have a log in their eye. And then in verse 5, Jesus calls that hypothetical person a hypocrite, and he instructs them to remove the log from their eye, and then and only then can they see clearly. And seeing clearly is for the purpose of the audience helping their brother with their speck. And so those are just my initial observations reading the text. And then once we've made initial observations, if you have more, you can feel free to comment them. But then we have from our initial observations, we ask our detailed questions, our detail seeking questions, which are going to be the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And so when you ask the who question, you're trying to get every who you can out of that text. The first who, for me always, is who's the author. And it's the Gospel of Matthew. It was written by Matthew according to unanimous church tradition from the 2nd century on. And most Christians don't find any good reason to doubt that. There are some skeptical scholars that are going to say, well, the Gospels were originally written down and then they got the names put on them later. There's not any good evidence to believe that. There's a great book called The Case for Jesus, which is not the book The Case for Christ, and it's written by a man named Brant Petrie. And he goes over the reasons for and against, and I invite everyone to read that book and see that the traditional stance makes the most sense of the data that we have. It's Jesus speaking. So that paragraph that we studied through there is Jesus speaking. The audience is made up of the disciples and the crowds from Galilee, Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond the Jordan. That information I got from chapter 5, when the crowds gather. And his illustration also includes a hypothetical you and your brother. Like I said, I try to include every who that I can think of, or that I observe in the passage, even if the who's are hypothetical or illustrative. Now, the next question I can ask is what? In each of these questions, you're not always going to have an answer. Sometimes a passage might say that Jesus walked from this place to that place, and you don't know why. Or Jesus went from here to there, and you don't know how. And that's just the nature of the beast. Sometimes the text doesn't answer all the questions that you're asking, but these are just to draw out as much detail as you can, so that when you try to interpret the text, you have as much information at your disposal as possible. But this question of what, my what is Jesus doing? And Jesus warns his audience that the measure which they use to judge will be used against them. And then the next question I have here is where? Well, this is the Sermon on the Mount, and that's commonly thought to be on a mount they call the Mount of the Beatitudes that's in northern Israel. That's not certain, but that's the best place we have as far as testimony. And that also wasn't an observation from the text. That's just a little tidbit of outside the extra biblical data. And then when? Well, the sermon likely took place in the late 20s or early 30s, because if Jesus dies in 30 AD or 33 AD, it couldn't have taken place any earlier or later than that window. In his illustration, Jesus gives a sequence that must take place before his audience can help their brother. First, they must remove the log from their eye. Then they can see clearly, and that makes them able to help their brother remove their speck. And so, like I said, even when it's in illustrations, if there's a sort of timeline given or a sequence of events, then, those are when questions that you can add to your observations. And then why? Jesus says to avoid judging with standards that you do not live up to yourself, because that standard will be used against you. So that because that standard will be used against you is the answer to the why question. How? Jesus explains that the way his audience actually can help their brother is by removing the log in their eye before helping their brother with the speck in his. Another how, which I missed here, another how would be how you're going to be judged. And Jesus tells you you're going to be judged by the standard that you judged others by. And so these are just some notes on what I saw the structure of that text, or you can call this a verse by verse structure. Jesus issues an imperative, which is sort of like instructions, a moral ought, you ought to do this thing, and a reason for that. And then he gives an explanation, and he kind of repeats the same thing. And then he poses a question through an illustration. Then he poses another question through an illustration, which ends up being repetitive again. And you'll see him that Jesus drives points home this way. And then finally he gives an imperative and explains even better the entire illustration that he gives. And so this is my outline for the passage. Jesus issues an imperative to the crowd: do not judge. He explains why, so that you will not be judged. He explains that the standard they use will be used to judge them. He asks an illustrative question, the why do you look at your, right? And then he asks a follow-up illustrative rhetorical question, or how can you, right? And that question is there, it seems, to drive a point home. You can't help your brother with his failings if you have these huge failings in your own life. Jesus instructs his audience to first remove the log in their eye so that they can assist their brother. Now, that is my rough outline of the passage before I consult any secondary resources. And you should always do your best to extract the meaning out of the text. This way, making those observations, this way before consulting outside, because you don't want to outsource your thinking. You don't want to just take some Bible scholars' word for it, because Bible scholars are going to disagree about things. They're going to have their own motives. They're going to miss observations. Next week again, or then in the next lesson again, I will bring up Bible scholars' commentary and show you that without a doubt they missed an observation. Just so that we know to be careful with those. If you've made thorough observations, you are less likely to be duped in that way. But R.T. France here wrote a commentary that's just called The Gospel of Matthew, and it's a solid commentary. And we're going to go over some notes of his. Verses 1 through 5, by contrast, convey an obvious message. They address the very down-to-earth issue of unfairly critical attitudes to others, which combined with a naive lack of self-criticism threaten to disrupt to disrupt a close-knit community such as that of Jesus' first disciples. And so what we find here is R.T. France drawing from the text that the thing that Jesus is actually trying to attack is not all judgments ever, but a sort of naive lack of self-criticism and an unfairly critical attitude toward others. A simple negative instruction is supported by an explanatory comment and by a parable which uses bored humor to show up the ludicrous inappropriateness of such behavior. Underlying the whole pericope is a principle of reciprocity, such as we have noted above in the previous chapter, which will be taken up again in the summary in verse 12. We must expect to be treated as we treat other people. And so this is actually something that I didn't notice, which I think I'll touch on again here in the next couple slides, is that this is something I didn't notice dozens of times I've read through this passage, is that Jesus is actually making a sort of carpenter family joke here, in that if one person has a piece of sawdust or a speck in their eye and the other person has a log, he's probably talking about a family shop, right? And as we all know, Jesus was a carpenter. And what you'll find is subtle things like this that maybe you didn't pick up on, that other Bible scholars did pick up on. Verses 1 to 2 do not specify who will do the judging of those who judge others. And that's something that I noted earlier, that it's not actually specifically said who is going to judge you. It just says that you will be judged. It would be possible to read this merely as a warning about the way society may be expected to react to those it perceives as hypocrites. But in the light of, and that's verses from chapter 6, we should probably read this as a divine passive. So sometimes in Scripture, it's just implied that it's God that's going to do something. And this is probably one of those cases. Just as God will forgive only the forgiving, So it's referring back to the Lord's Prayer. So he will judge his people as they judge others. The verb, whatever that says, is used for technical legal decisions, but also more generally for forming judgments. So we're talking about the word that was used for judge, and reaching conclusions about both things and people. The verb is not in itself necessarily negative, but the following illustration shows that here the emphasis is on criticism of other people's failings, and the warning, so that you may not be judged, makes it clear that this sort of judging is not something to be welcomed. For the warning that criticism can be turned back against itself, against the one who criticizes, compare our proverb, people who live in glass houses should not throw stones. And that's a common phrase that we use nowadays. It is this reciprocal principle which is the focus of the whole pericope, rather than a prohibition of any use of the critical faculty itself. And that's a very scholarly way of saying the same thing that I was saying earlier, in that the point of the passage is not to never judge anyone. The reason we can know that is because the point of Jesus' parable was not take the log out of your own eye and pretend like your brother doesn't have a speck in his eye. At the end of the parable, he implores you to help your brother once you have removed the log from your eye. So the point of this passage cannot be that you never judge anyone. The robust imagery from the carpenter's workshop makes two related points: the inappropriateness of drawing attention to another's failing when your own is much greater, and the impracticability and insincerity of an offer to help until your own greater problem has been dealt with. And so, again, this is a scholarly way of saying what I was talking about earlier, in that the point of the parable is that it's inappropriate to point out someone else's small failings while you have huge failings that you're oblivious to. And it's impractical to try to insincerely offer help when you know you can't help them. And the example I often give is, if I was cheating on my wife, I could not offer help or guidance to my friend who struggles with pornography addiction or something of that nature. The person being criticized is described as the critic's brother, as in chapter 5. The term is probably used here for a fellow disciple, and not necessarily a male one, rather than literally a member of the same family, though it might be argued that the term belongs merely to the setting of the parable, with two siblings working together in the family workshop. And I think that makes the most sense of the text. Here are some notes from the Net Bible. Remember, we have printed secondary resources as well as online secondary resources. And really, it's just the first point that I was going to focus on, but just so you see here, you can see that the word splinter could also be a small piece of wood, chaff, straw. Some translations translate it sawdust. You see all kinds of gems in the notes on the Net Bible and virtually any other good study Bible. But the first point up here, the point of the statement, do not judge, so that you will not be judged, is that the standards we apply to others, God applies to us. Remember, they're taking the passive, what they call it, the divine passive in this case. The passive verb will not be judged. Has God is the unstated performer of the action. That's a weird English thing. I copied this straight from the Net Bible, so if it's weird, I'm blaming them this time. Such usage is generally thought to have arisen within Judaism out of the tendency to minimize the mention of God's name out of reverence for God, and carried over into early Christian tradition, although in this particular verse the agent may be left unstated, more for rhetorical effect. In that instance, I think they're saying that it's more ominous to just leave God's name out altogether. And so, in our interpretation step, once we've consulted those things, we should be able to put the passage into our own words and try to explain our observations. And so Jesus instructs his followers, do not judge others according to standards that you do not live up to, because that standard will be judged by God when he judges you. You cannot help someone with their failings while ignoring your own. So you must first deal with your own failings so that you can help them. So once we've done our observations, consulted our commentaries and worked on an interpretation of the passage, that's when we can finally ask the question that many people ask right away. And that is an application question. What does this mean for me? Right? Once we've determined what it meant and who it meant it to, right? The original audience, then we can say, what does this have to do with me, a 21st century Christian in English-speaking America? Well, how does your life change because of what you've learned? And so for me, these were some personal, notes here. What does this mean for me? I need to keep in mind that God is the final judge, right? As I walk around daily, sort of making my mental judgments, I need to keep in mind that God is the final judge, and that I ought to be at least as critical about my own failings as I am of others. I should avoid hypocritical judgments, especially when my failings are much worse. And then, if it is appropriate to judge someone's failings. So when it is appropriate to judge someone's failings, it should be with the intention to help them. Some other questions you can ask yourself is, how should this affect how I think of myself? And how should this change my relationship with others? And those are believers, non-believers, spouses, children, all those sorts of things. We all develop habits of being overly critical sometimes, especially with people closest to us. And so how should this affect your relationship with your family? And so when I was teaching the class in person, we had a conclusion slide and we talked about our conclusions. But since this is online, if you have any thoughts in closing, just post them in the comments, and I will see you guys in the next lesson.